The last meal. How Paleolithic nomads processed megafauna in deep snow. The mammoth had been dead for perhaps 18 hours when the band found it. Not killed by them. This one had gone down on its own, somewhere in the blue-gray hours before dawn, in a shallow depression between two ridgelines where the snow had drifted to a depth that made the final stages of its struggle visible in the disturbed surface. Long before the carcass itself came into view, the depression was filled with the evidence of that struggle. A wide radius of compacted and churned snow, streaked in places with the ochre brown of partially frozen blood, crossed by the drag marks of a massive body that had tried and failed multiple times to regain its footing on a surface that offered nothing to push against. The band's lead tracker, a man whose name is lost to us but whose competence is written into the archaeological record of his tools, and the kill sites his community left behind across a landscape that is now the central plain of what we call France, read all of this in the time it took to walk from the ridgeline to the carcass. He knew the animal had died of exhaustion compounded by cold. He knew it had been dead long enough for the internal organs to have begun cooling, but not long enough for the deep muscle mass to have frozen solid. He knew with the immediate practical urgency that governed every decision in a world without food storage technology beyond the cold itself, that the next several hours would determine whether his band of approximately 23 people, 11 adults, 7 adolescents, 5 children, would eat adequately through the following week, or face the slow physiological deterioration that began with hunger and ended in a landscape where the caloric demands of cold weather survival were unrelenting and the margin between adequate nutrition and fatal energy deficit was narrow, in a place that Paleolithic people understood viscerally, even if they lacked the neurological vocabulary to name it. What followed at that depression in the snow, over the course of approximately 9 to 11 hours of continuous collective labor, conducted in temperatures that experimental archaeologists working in analogous conditions have estimated at between -18 and -25 degrees Celsius, was one of the most technically complex and physically demanding food processing operations available to any human society at any point in history. The butchering and processing of a fully grown woolly mammoth, an animal that in life weighed between 4 and 8 metric tons, and whose carcass presented the processing team with a surface area, a structural complexity, and a sheer material volume that has no equivalent in the experience of any modern person who has not specifically studied it, required a level of collective organization, technical knowledge, tool management, and physical coordination that challenges the still persistent cultural assumption that Paleolithic people were cognitively or socially simpler than their descendants. They were not simpler, they were differently specialized, and the specialization required to process a megafauna carcass efficiently in deep snow, in extreme cold, with stone tools, under time pressure imposed by freezing temperatures, competing scavengers, and the physiological limits of the workers themselves, was as demanding as any technical specialization that later periods of human history have produced. The snow itself was simultaneously the processing team's greatest logistical obstacle, and their most important enabling resource. And understanding this paradox is essential to understanding how the operation worked. Deep snow, the kind that accumulates in the topographic depressions and lee slopes of a periglacial landscape to depths of 1 to 2 meters, creates a processing environment that is hostile in several immediate and obvious ways. It is unstable. It provides no solid working surface for the controlled application of force that butchering requires. It conceals the ground beneath, preventing the use of rock outcroppings or consolidated soil as working platforms. It insulates the lower portions of a large carcass, slowing the freezing process that the processing team actually wants to exploit, and it complicates the movement of people and materials around a work site where rapid repositioning is frequently necessary. These are real obstacles, and Paleolithic processing teams address them through a combination of physical site preparation and systematic work sequencing that is archaeologically visible in the spatial organization of lithic debris, the discarded stone flakes and exhausted tool cores, at documented mammoth kill and processing sites across Europe and northern Asia. Site preparation began immediately upon arrival at the carcass, and before any processing work commenced, the snow around the carcass was compacted by trampling, a simple but effective technique for converting loose deep snow into a surface firm enough to stand on, while applying significant downward and lateral force. The compaction radius extended approximately 3 meters beyond the carcass on all sides, creating a working platform that, while not as stable as frozen ground, provided sufficient resistance to allow controlled tool use. In areas where the snow depth was sufficient, the processing team excavated working pits adjacent to the carcass. Depressions pressed or dug into the snow surface that allowed workers to position themselves at optimal height relative to specific anatomical zones of the carcass without requiring them to kneel or lie in loose snow, a position that would rapidly conduct body heat away from the knees, thighs, and abdomen through the combined mechanisms of conduction and compression of insulating clothing layers. These snow pits functioned as ergonomic workstations, shaped to the specific task being performed in them, and they are the kind of adaptive environmental modification that leaves no direct archaeological trace but is clearly implied by the physical logic of the work. The tools brought to a megafauna processing event by a competent Paleolithic band were not generalized cutting implements, but a carefully composed technical kit assembled for the specific sequential tasks that large carcass processing required. And the distinction between these tools, in terms of their raw material, their manufacturing technique, and their maintained condition, reflects a level of pre-planning and material literacy that is worth examining in specific detail. The initial work of accessing the carcass, penetrating the mammoth's outer integument, which in a fully grown woolly mammoth consists of a hide between 2 and 3 centimeters thick, underlain by a subcutaneous fat layer that can reach 30 centimeters in depth, and that in cold conditions develops a consistency somewhere between dense rubber and stiff foam, required the heaviest and most robust tools in the kit. Large bifacial hand axes and heavy-duty scrapers napped from flint, quartzite, or whatever locally available cryptocrystalline silicate offered the best combination of fracture predictability and edge retention, were used for the initial penetration cuts along the dorsal midline and the limb insertion points. These cuts were not random incisions. They followed established anatomical pathways that experienced processors had internalized as precisely as a modern surgeon internalizes the layered structure of the tissues they work through. Pathways that minimized tool wear, maximized cutting efficiency, and opened access to the underlying muscle mass with the minimum expenditure of energy and tool edge length. The subcutaneous fat layer deserves specific attention because its processing was among the highest caloric priorities of the entire operation, and because its physical properties under cold conditions created both opportunities and challenges that shaped the processing sequence in fundamental ways. Mammoth fat, rendered from the subcutaneous layer, the orbital fat deposits behind the eyes, the mesenteric fat surrounding the abdominal organs, and the specialized fat reserves concentrated in the hump above the shoulders, represents the single most calorically dense food resource available to a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer community in a northern cold weather environment. Fat provides approximately 9 kilocalories per gram, compared to approximately 4 kilocalories per gram for protein, and in a metabolic environment where maintaining core body temperature against sustained extreme cold requires continuous caloric expenditure that can reach 4,000 to 5,000 kilocalories per adult per day. The fat reserves of a single mammoth represented a caloric windfall of almost incomprehensible magnitude by the daily experiential standards of a band that might otherwise subsist on smaller game. Plant foods were seasonally available, and the accumulated stored energy of their own body fat reserves. The processing team knew this with the kind of knowledge that does not require articulation, because it is written into the body's response to food after deprivation. They felt it in the urgency with which the fat deposits were identified, accessed, and either immediately consumed or prioritized for transport and storage. In cold conditions, mammoth fat presents a processing paradox. Below approximately -10 degrees Celsius, subcutaneous fat begins to solidify, transitioning from the semi-liquid consistency of room temperature lard to a firm, waxy solid that resists cutting and cannot be efficiently separated from the overlying hide or the underlying fascia without generating sufficient heat through friction or direct contact with warm hands and tools to partially reliquefy its surface layer. Experienced processors manage this property by maintaining continuous hand contact with the fat during separation work, using the residual heat of their own bodies as a precision thermal tool to keep the working surface of the fat deposit pliable enough for the scraping and cutting operations required to separate it cleanly from adjacent tissues. This technique, which seems almost impossibly delicate when described in the context of a large-scale outdoor butchering operation conducted in extreme cold, is documented in experimental archaeology trials as genuinely effective. Processors who maintain direct skin contact with the fat surface throughout the separation sequence achieved significantly cleaner fat recovery, with less waste and less tool wear, than processors who used insulated grip techniques. The body in this context was a tool, deployed with the same deliberateness as any stone implement. The muscular anatomy of a woolly mammoth presented the processing team with a structural engineering challenge that required systematic problem solving rather than simple brute force. The major muscle groups of the hindquarters, the gluteal complex, the quadriceps, and the deep hip adductors, in a fully grown mammoth represent individual muscle masses of between 40 and 80 kilograms each, bound by fascial sheaths of extraordinary toughness and integrated with the skeletal structure through tendinous attachments of considerable mechanical strength. Separating these muscle groups from the underlying skeleton and from each other required a tool use approach that combined precise anatomical knowledge of the fascial planes between muscle groups with the mechanical understanding of how to apply cutting force along these planes rather than across them. Cutting across a fascial plane, working against the orientation of the connective tissue fibers, requires significantly more force and produces significantly more tool edge degradation than cutting along the plane, where the blade follows the natural separation between tissue layers and the resistance drops dramatically. This is not a distinction that a person learns from a single processing experience. It accumulates over years of practice on smaller animals, refined on larger ones, and transmitted to younger members of the band through direct demonstration and supervised participation. The deep cold of the processing environment created a time management problem of considerable complexity that overlaid every other aspect of the operation. The exterior surfaces of the carcass, exposed to ambient air temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius and to wind if the site was exposed, were actively freezing throughout the processing period. The rate of freezing was not uniform. It proceeded from the skin surface inward through the fat, and then into the muscle tissue at a rate determined by the local thickness of each layer, the thermal conductivity of the tissue type, and the degree to which the hide had been opened to allow cold air direct access to the underlying tissues. Processors working on the lateral surfaces of the carcass were always racing against this freezing front, because muscle tissue that has frozen solid cannot be efficiently processed with stone tools. The crystalline structure of frozen meat resists the sliding shear that stone blades apply, causing them to deflect rather than cut. And the force required to penetrate frozen tissue exceeds the mechanical strength of even well-knapped flint edges, causing them to fracture and fail. The processing sequence was therefore structured to prioritize the anatomical zones with the thinnest insulating layers, the limb musculature, the facial tissues, the abdominal contents, before moving to the deep trunk musculature that the thick subcutaneous fat layer would protect from freezing for a longer period. This sequencing is archaeologically visible in the pattern of cut marks on mammoth bones at processing sites, where the distribution and orientation of lithic cut marks on different skeletal elements reflects the order in which those elements were accessed. A frozen record of a time management strategy developed and refined across generations of cold weather megafauna processing. The abdominal cavity, once accessed through a midline incision extending from the sternum to the pubic symphysis, presented the processing team with an anatomical inventory of extraordinary complexity and nutritional diversity. Intestinal tract of a woolly mammoth, which in life contained the partially digested remains of the animal's last several meals, grasses, sedges, herbaceous plants, and in winter the bark and cambium tissue of whatever woody vegetation was accessible, needed to be removed rapidly and moved away from the processing area, both because it occupied space required for access to the more nutritionally valuable organs, and because its contents, if allowed to spill into the body cavity, would contaminate the surrounding tissues with digestive acids and bacterial populations that would accelerate spoilage. The liver, kidneys, heart, and lungs were removed in sequence and immediately distributed among the group for consumption. These organs cool and freeze faster than the deep muscle tissue, and their consumption at the processing site, rather than transport, preserve their nutritional value, and eliminated a significant transport weight. The liver of a mammoth weighing between 40 and 70 kilograms represented an extraordinary concentration of fat-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin K, that were nutritionally critical to a population living through a northern winter on a diet dominated by animal protein and fat, with minimal access to plant-sourced micronutrients. Its consumption was not merely a caloric event, it was a nutritional correction, addressing deficiencies that accumulated through the winter months and that, without periodic access to organ meat, could produce the clinical syndromes: night blindness, bone fragility, impaired immune function, that made northern winter survival a sustained biological challenge as much as a thermal one. The transport of processed material away from the carcass site to the band's camp or temporary shelter posed logistical problems that were as carefully managed as any element of the processing itself. The total usable mass recoverable from a large mammoth, muscle meat, fat, organ tissue, marrow-bearing bones, hide, and sinew, could reach 2,000 kilograms or more, a quantity that far exceeded the single-journey transport capacity of a band of 23 people moving through deep snow. The solution was not to attempt a single transport, but to establish a staged caching system, burying processed portions in the snow at the processing site, or at intermediate points along the return route to camp, using the cold itself as a preservation medium that would maintain the cached material in usable condition for days or weeks. Snow burial at depths of 50 centimeters or more protected cached meat from the ravens, wolves, wolverines, and cave hyenas that were drawn to processing sites by the smell of blood and opened viscera, and the insulating properties of the snowpack slowed the freezing of cached material to a rate that preserved its texture and nutritional quality better than surface exposure. The cache locations were marked using methods that are archaeologically invisible: arrangements of stones, broken branches, specific landmarks known to the band, but that were apparently reliable enough that return trips to process and transport cached material were a routine element of megafauna exploitation strategy, documented in the spatial distribution of lithic tool caches and faunal remains at sites where multiple processing episodes are archaeologically distinguishable. The hide was among the last elements of the carcass to be processed, not because it was the least valued. Mammoth hide was an extraordinarily valuable raw material for clothing, shelter construction, and container manufacture, but because its removal required the carcass to be repositioned, a physically demanding operation that was more efficiently accomplished after the removal of the overlying fat and the major muscle masses had reduced the carcass weight sufficiently to allow the remaining structure to be rolled or levered using wooden poles. The hide of a woolly mammoth is a layered structure consisting of an outer guard hair coat of coarse, long hair over a dense underfur of fine crimped fiber, all attached to a skin of between 1 and 2 centimeters thickness that, when fresh, is both heavy and flexible. Removal required long, continuous cuts along established anatomical lines to produce hide panels of maximum size, because large continuous panels were more useful for shelter and clothing construction than fragmented pieces. And the effort required to join hide pieces with sinew stitching, a time-consuming process conducted with bone needles under cold and frequently low-light conditions, made every unnecessary cut in the hide a cost paid later in labor and thread. Experienced hide removers worked in pairs along each major cut line, one maintaining tension on the freed edge of the hide, while the other worked the blade along the separation plane between the skin and the subcutaneous fascia, a collaboration that required both physical coordination and communicative efficiency, achieved through the kind of practiced nonverbal synchronization that develops only between people who have performed the same operation together many times. By the time the processing operation concluded, sometime in the late afternoon or early evening of the day following the carcass's discovery, depending on the band's size, their tool supply, and the severity of the cold, the depression in the snow that had held the mammoth's final struggle was transformed into something that looks, in the archaeological record, like organized chaos, but was in reality an organized conclusion. The skeletal elements remaining at the site bore the systematic cut marks of competent butchery, conducted by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The spatial distribution of lithic debris around the site reflected the sequential organization of the processing work, with tool densities highest at the anatomical zones processed first, and decreasing outward toward the zones accessed later, when the processing team had spread across a wider working area. The cache sites in the surrounding snow held the portions that could not be transported in a single journey. And the band itself, moving away from the site in the failing light of a Paleolithic winter afternoon, was carrying, in their bodies, in their transported loads, in the hide bundles and bone packages, and rendered fat containers made from sections of the stomach and pericardium, the caloric and material resources that would sustain them through the next phase of their movement across a landscape that offered everything needed for survival to those with the knowledge to extract it, and nothing at all to those without. This is what the last meal looked like. Not a meal in any sense that the word typically implies. Not a moment of sitting, of warmth, of social ease around a fire with food already prepared and the labor of its acquisition safely concluded. It was a 9-hour collective technical operation, conducted in extreme cold by people whose physical and cognitive capabilities were identical to ours, applied to problems whose difficulty and whose stakes were beyond anything that the overwhelming majority of modern humans will ever directly encounter. The mammoth fed them, but they earned every calorie of it, with tools made of stone, knowledge made of generations, and hands that never stopped moving in the cold.
The woolly track shows full absorption capacity.
Nutrient levels stabilizing across the board.
Anatomical structure remains stable.
Fat layer would protect from freezing for a longer period. This sequencing is archaeologically visible in the pattern of cut marks on mammoth bones at processing. Fat layer would protect from freezing for a longer period. This sequencing is archaeologically visible in the pattern of cut marks on mammoth bones at processing.